Today I'm going to turn these cedar fence pickets into this outdoor bar. Let's build it. This hot tub bar design was inspired by Season 9 of the Builders Challenge. The Builders Challenge is a biannual competition for the maker community in which designs are provided for a specific item to build, and then you as the builder can kind of tweak the designs to make it your own. For Season 9, builders were provided plans for a modern style bench that had a planter built into it. We didn't really need a bench, but we did need a bar for our hot tub, so we decided to tweak these designs to turn it into a modern style hot tub bar that would also have a planter or a spot for your cooler with adult beverages. I started off by making a lot of cedar wood chips and sawdust by planing all of these cedar fence pickets down to a 1/2 inch. I wanted them to all have a nice smooth side rather than the rough side that comes from the lumber store, so we went ahead and just planed them all down about 1/8 of an inch. After all the boards were planed to the right thickness, we cleaned up the edges and then ripped them all to the right width. Then I cut all the pieces to their respective lengths. Because this project was going to require so many different slats, I went ahead and just kept a tally of all the different lengths to make sure I had enough. For this project, I used a mobile miter saw station to do all my cuts. If you had a stop block system, that would be ideal for doing these repetitive lengths. But since I didn't have a stop block system, I went ahead and used the same original piece that I cut for each length as a template for each consecutive piece. That is, you don't want to use piece 2, piece 3, piece 4 that you cut. Always make your reference cuts from the original piece you cut. This way, if there's any slight deviation from that original length, it's always from the same original cut piece. And that'll help minimize your overall differences in length from stack-up error. So you probably noticed earlier from the other photos that the big rounded corner and the individual slats are what really give this thing its modern look. So let me take a moment to kind of break this down. So all this is a repetitive pattern of 3 pieces. Piece 1, which makes the legs, piece 2, which makes the bar top, and piece 3, which is a filler piece. Now piece 1 is simply a straight piece that has a 20-degree angled cut on both ends. There's nothing rounded about this piece. Now piece 2 and piece 3 share the exact same curve, but they're just flipped 180 degrees. So now let me show you how I made this curve. The magic tool was none other than a 5-gallon bucket. The geometry and trigonometry of this 5-gallon bucket bottom works out just perfectly so that that 20-degree angle of the legs is a perfect transition into this curve. Once I had the curve traced out, I just cut 2 boards at a time using a jigsaw, and then I took them over to a disc sander in order to smooth it all out. The last of the major pieces I needed were those to make the tower to hold the ice chest. Because this design uses an alternating ingrain pattern, this required 4 different size pieces. I once again batched out all the pieces all at once, just keeping a tally of how many pieces I had left to go. Once everything was cut, all pieces got a good sanding to prepare them for stain. We stained all pieces using a gun stock stain from Varathane, and I was able to get a little help from my wife Lauren. So now that almost all the pieces were made and stained, it was time to start assembly. So the tower itself I was going to assemble with dowel joinery, so I started off by marking all of the pieces with the centers for the dowels. I then took all these pieces over to the drill press to make sure that I got straight holes through all of these pieces. I'll later use these pieces as a guide for using a hand drill to get the holes into the end grain of the other pieces that would join up to these. I then got all the dowels ready by cutting a whole mess load of about 1 1/4 inch long red oak dowels, and I just used a PVC pipe cutter to do this because it made really easy work of it. I then took all these small pieces of 1/4-inch dowel over to the disc sander to give them a slight bevel on one end to make them easier to start into the holes. For the assembly, I just used Titebond 3 for its water resistant properties and just clamped all the pieces together. And then I went ahead and aligned a drill very carefully by hand to drill into the end grain of those side pieces. I used a piece of tape to mark this drill bit to ensure that the depth of this hole was no more than about 1 inch deep. That way about 1/4 inch of the dowel rods would stick out to be able to flush cut. I then just put a little bit of the Titebond 3 on the dowels themselves, put them into the holes and tapped them into place, and then I used a flush cut saw to cut them flush with the sides. Once all the dowels were flush cut, I used a little bit of 320 grit sandpaper to make everything nice and smooth. And once one box was done, it was on to the next. Once I was done building all the boxes, I used an 1/8 inch router bit at the router table in order to cut a groove inside the perimeter of all of the boxes. This groove will be used to insert a spline piece in between all the boxes to help keep them aligned so that the outside faces were all perfectly even with each other, as well as give it some support and stability whenever it glued up. Because this was such a small groove and it was a stop groove, it didn't actually go through the ends, and there was no way for the dust to actually get out and be sucked up by the vacuum. It all got really packed in there, so I had to do a lot of cleaning before I was ready to actually glue these up. I then filled all the grooves with glue, once again using the Titebond 3 for its water resistant properties. Inserted the splines and put some more glue on it, and then put the boxes on top of each other, kind of snapped them into place on those splines, clamped them together, and then kept repeating this process until I was very close to the top. So when I was about 2 boxes from the top, that's where I decided to go ahead and mount the supports to hold the ice chest in. I wanted something that would actually let the water through whenever it rains rather than holding the water, so I didn't want a solid bottom. So I decided to just do 2 little braces that would run across in order to hold the ice chest in place. I went ahead and mounted 2 supports to the inside walls of the tower. I did forget to stain these pieces, but they are cedar, so they're going to be a little resistant to rot, and they're not really going to be visible, so I won't tell anybody if you won't tell anybody. Anyway, I went ahead and mounted my platforms on top of these, anchored them in place, and then I was able to finish assembling the last 2 layers of the tower. The next day when the tower was actually dry, I was able to put the final pieces on it, which included some trim pieces on the top and some feet. So I'll just kind of walk you through what I did to make them. Basically for the trim pieces, I just cut some mitered pieces slightly larger than what the actual tower dimensions are, and then I beveled the underside edge, which you can't see here, to 45 degrees. And then I drilled a few holes in them, once again attached them with dowel joinery, flush cut it all, and sanded it smooth. For the feet, I just used 2.5 inch square pieces, once again cut the bevel on 2 sides, and then glued and screwed it to the bottom corners of the tower. Alright, so now that the tower was out of the way, it was time to finally start working on the part that would actually become the legs and the bar top. So I started off by putting a single pocket hole on the leg pieces at the end that would be attaching to the bar top pieces. This would be a good time to identify the pieces that you want to be on the outside that everybody will see, basically the pieces that'll be the nicest, and you want to make sure that the actual pocket hole is on the inside piece of those and not on the outward facing side of those pieces. For the other pieces that'll be sandwiched in the middle, it doesn't really matter. So once I had all the pocket holes drilled, it was time to actually connect the leg pieces to all the bar top pieces. Alright, so for the actual assembly, this was a very tedious process and took a whole lot longer than I thought it would. But there's basically 3 spacer pieces that you have to glue in. One that'll go at the bottom of the feet, one that goes at the rounded joint, and then one that goes all the way at the top by the tower. So to start with, I roughed up all the areas that would receive glue with 80 grit sandpaper just to make sure the stain wasn't going to affect the glue bond. After that, it was basically a series of putting glue on one side of the spacer pieces, clamping them down on what was already on the table, and then once I got all 3 spacer pieces down, they should somewhat be secure and not moving around from the glue anymore, so I could take the clamps off, glue the other side, and then put down the next layer of bar top and leg combo. Like I said, this was a very time-consuming process, so about halfway through I did get Lauren to come out and help me continue gluing and assembling this all. I think in the end, even with the help, it still took about an hour and a half to get everything glued and clamped up. Alright, so after that had all dried and was nice and solid, I was able to use it against the tower to actually measure out where a support needed to go. So basically I just set it against it, marked it, drilled some holes, put some glue on the support, and then anchored it from the inside with some screws. So the last thing I did to tie in some of the dowel joinery used everywhere else was put some aesthetic looking dowel joinery on the bar and legs. This was not actual dowel joinery going all the way through the structure. It was just about 1.5 to 2 inches deep. Basically just drilled the hole, put the dowel joint in, flush cut it, sanded it, you know the drill. Last thing I did before attaching this was work on this part that actually bumps right up to the tower. You want to make sure that this has a perfectly straight edge, because otherwise it'll be very noticeable, because you got to keep in mind what it's going up against is a perfectly flat board. So I spent some time with a flush cut saw, a sander, and some squares in order to make sure it was nice and straight, and once that was done, it was ready to attach. Then finished it with stain one last time. Now I knew this was going to be a problem trying to keep the contrast between the dowel rods and the cedar, but we figured we would try the deodorant stick trick where you rub a little bit of deodorant on what you don't want the stain to get on and it would help keep it off. However, all I had was this Old Spice gel stick and that did not work really well. I think the intent is to use one of those waxy dry sticks, and that wax will help prevent it better. So my recommendation was use either one of the dry sticks or maybe some candle wax or something like that, and it'll probably work a lot better. Well, there you have it, guys and gals. This is our modern style outdoor bar. Thanks a lot to the Builders Challenge for the inspiration for this design. If you like this video, please consider subscribing. Otherwise, until next time, take a chance and build something.